The ballroom of Ashford Manor glittered like a fallen constellation that evening. 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers, champagne flowing like liquid gold, and laughter rising above the soft swell of a string quartet. Every woman in London had dreamed of standing in this room. Only one had captured the heart of its master. And she was about to lose everything. Elara Sinclair stood near the tall arched window, her ivory gown catching the candlelight, her dark hair pinned in soft curls at the nape of her neck. She was not the most dazzling woman in the room, she knew that. She had no title, no fortune, no family name worth speaking aloud in polite society. What she had was quieter than all of that. She had the Duke of Westmere's heart. Or so she believed. His name was Sebastian Ashford, the 8th Duke of Westmere, and he was the kind of man that poets attempted and failed to describe adequately. Tall, dark-haired, with gray eyes the color of a winter sea just before a storm. He was not warm by nature. He was composed, precise, and devastatingly private. Society called him cold. Elara knew better. She had seen him kneel in the garden to rescue an injured sparrow. She had heard him laugh, truly laugh, not the performative chuckle he offered at dinner tables, when she read to him from ridiculous adventure novels on rainy afternoons. She had felt his hands, always so controlled in public, tremble slightly the first time he held her face and whispered that she was the only thing in his world that felt entirely real. They had been engaged for 4 months. The wedding was set for the 1st of September, 6 weeks away. Elara had stepped away from the ballroom to find her sister, Vivienne, who had gone quiet and strange over the past few weeks. Vivienne was 3 years younger, golden-haired and vivacious, built for admiration the way a rose is built for summer. She had always existed in a world slightly brighter than Elara's, drawing light effortlessly. Elara had never resented her for it. She loved Vivienne completely, the fierce, uncomplicated love that only sisters who have survived a difficult childhood together truly understand. She found them in the east corridor. The door to the private study was open, just slightly, just enough. Elara had pushed it gently, expecting to find a servant or perhaps a lost guest. Instead, the candlelight from within fell across 2 silhouettes so close together they seemed like one. Sebastian's hand was cupping Vivienne's face, the same way he had once held Elara's. Vivienne's fingers were curled into the lapel of his jacket. Their foreheads were touching. They were speaking in whispers. Elara could not hear the words. She did not need to. The world she had carefully, cautiously allowed herself to believe in, the world where she was chosen, where she was enough, where love was not something that eventually left, collapsed in absolute silence. No dramatic crash. No sound at all. Just the quiet, devastating implosion of everything she had trusted. She stepped back from the doorway. She did not cry. She did not confront them. She did not wait to hear an explanation that she was quite certain would destroy her entirely if spoken aloud. She walked back down the corridor with measured steps, retrieved her shawl from the cloakroom, descended the front steps of Ashford Manor, and disappeared into the London fog like she had never existed at all. By morning she was gone. She left no letter for Sebastian. She left one for Vivienne, 3 words only, "I forgive you." Because she did, eventually. But she could not stay and watch. She was not built for that particular cruelty. She had a small amount of savings. A former schoolmistress in the north of England who had once offered her a position teaching literature to young girls. She took a coach at dawn, then a train, then another coach, moving steadily away from London, from ballrooms, from gray-eyed dukes and golden-haired sisters and the particular agony of loving people who could not love you back the way you deserved. She did not know, as the English countryside blurred past the rain-streaked window, that she was carrying Sebastian Ashford's child. She did not know for another 4 weeks. When she did, she sat very still for a long time in her small, cold room above the schoolhouse in the village of Dunmore, her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing. Then she made the only decision that felt survivable. She would keep the child. She would raise the child. She would never, under any circumstances, return to London. She would disappear so thoroughly that Sebastian Ashford would eventually conclude she had simply ceased to exist. For 5 years she succeeded. Dunmore was a quiet village pressed between rolling moors and a gray river that caught the sunrise in colors she had not expected. Amber and rose and a particular shade of violet that reminded her of nothing sad at all. The schoolhouse was small and perpetually cold in winter, but the girls she taught were sharp and funny and completely unimpressed with the social hierarchies that had governed every room she had ever stood in before. She loved them for it. She named her son James. He was, from the very first moment she held him, absolutely and entirely his father's child. The dark hair, the gray eyes, not stormy in James's case but luminous, curious, fixed on the world with an intensity that made people stop and look twice at a child barely old enough to walk. He had Sebastian's stillness too, that quality of deep, quiet attention that most people mistook for coldness until they understood it was actually its opposite. James was not cold. He was simply always watching, always thinking, always on the edge of asking a question so precise it would cut straight to the truth of a thing. He was 4 years old when he first asked about his father. Elara had prepared for this question the way one prepares for a storm, methodically, practically, with a kind of exhausted pragmatism. She told him his father was a good man who did not know he existed. She told him that sometimes love is complicated in ways that have nothing to do with whether you are wanted. She told him, and she meant this with every part of herself, that he was the most wanted person in the entire world. James considered this with his father's serious expression, then nodded and asked if he could have porridge. She laughed for the first time in what felt like years. Life in Dunmore was not the life she had imagined for herself. It was smaller, quieter, composed of simpler things. Morning lessons and ink-stained fingers and the particular satisfaction of watching a child understand something difficult for the first time. It was cold winters and muddy springs and a kind neighbor named Mrs. Hadley who brought soup on difficult days without being asked. It was good in its modest, unheroic way. And she was, if not happy in the way she had once imagined happiness, then something close to it. Something steadier. Something that did not depend on being chosen. She had almost stopped waiting for the world she had left to find her. Then, on a gray Tuesday morning in October, a black carriage with a crest she recognized rolled to a stop at the edge of the village square. Elara was crossing toward the schoolhouse with a stack of marked compositions tucked under her arm when she saw it. She stopped walking. The more wind pulled at her hair. She stood completely still, the way prey animals stand still when something large and dangerous enters their periphery, not from fear exactly, but from the body's ancient knowledge that this moment requires absolute clarity. The carriage door opened. Sebastian Ashford stepped out. He was older, 5 years older, and the difference was not in the lines of his face so much as something behind his eyes. He looked like a man who had been looking for something for a very long time and had not permitted himself to rest until he found it. He was dressed plainly, no ducal finery, no performance of rank. Just a dark coat and the gray eyes she had spent 5 years trying to forget, scanning the village square with that devastating, precise attention of his. They found her immediately. He went completely still. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind moved between them. A cart horse shifted on the cobblestones somewhere behind her. A child laughed in a distant doorway, a familiar laugh, high and bright, that sent a cold wave of recognition straight through her chest because she knew without turning whose laugh it was. James had followed her out of the cottage. Sebastian's gaze moved, slowly, inevitably, the way a compass needle moves toward north, from Elara's face to the small boy standing beside her. He looked at the dark hair. The gray eyes. The serious, curious, utterly familiar expression fixed on him with calm intensity. Sebastian's face did something she had never seen it do before. It broke. Not dramatically. Not with any of the theatrical collapse that lesser men might have performed in that moment. Just a quiet, profound fracture visible only in the slight parting of his lips, the way his hand moved and then stopped at his side, the expression in his eyes shifting from recognition to devastation to something she could not name but felt, against every rational intention, directly in her sternum. He looked back at her. "Elara," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Low, controlled, the accent of old money and older grief. But there was something raw underneath it now. Something that had not been there before. She lifted her chin. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised her. James tugged at her sleeve. "Mama," he said in that precise, interested way he had, "who is that man?" Elara looked down at her son, this small, luminous, entirely beloved person who had her stubbornness and his father's eyes and a laugh that could fill a cold room with something warm, and she felt the ground shift beneath 5 years of careful survival. Sebastian took one step toward them. Then he stopped, as though he did not trust himself to close the distance without permission. "I have been looking for you," he said. "Every day. For 5 years." His voice was not accusing. Was not angry. It was something far more difficult to withstand. It was simply, quietly, devastatingly honest. I went to the East Corridor that night to tell Vivienne that I knew what she felt and that nothing would come of it. That I was going to marry you. That there was no conversation to be had. He paused. She was crying. I was trying to be decent about it. That is what you saw. The stack of compositions slipped slightly in Elara's arms. I went to find you that same night, he continued. You were already gone. Something moved through his expression. I have been going mad rather quietly ever since. The wind came off the moors. James was watching Sebastian with the focused, solemn attention of a child who understands that something important is happening even if the specifics remain unclear. Elara looked at the man she had loved and lost and spent 5 years trying to stop loving, standing in a cold village square in the north of England with his heart completely unguarded on his face for the first time in all the years she had known him. She had survived without him. She knew that now with certainty. She was not the woman who had fled London in the dark anymore, shattered, wordless, unable to ask the questions that might have saved her years of grief. She was someone steadier now. Someone who did not need to be rescued. But needing and wanting, she was beginning to remember, were not the same thing. You should have written, she said at last. Her voice was quieter now. I did not know where you were, he said. I hired investigators. 3 of them over 5 years. A faint, pained almost smile. You are remarkably difficult to find when you wish to be. I had practice, she said, at disappearing. I know. He took another step. Stopped again. I would very much like it, he said, with the careful precision of a man who has rehearsed these words in the dark for a very long time, if you would consider never disappearing again. Elara said nothing for a long moment. The wind moved through the square, carrying the scent of rain from the distant moors, and she stood with her compositions pressed against her chest like armor, looking at the man who had, with no particular intention and no request for forgiveness, rearranged the entire geography of her interior world simply by stepping out of a carriage. James tugged her sleeve again. He was patient, her son, but he was also 4 years old and possessed of an almost scientific need to understand the things placed directly in front of him. Mama, he said again, more quietly this time, as though he sensed that the usual rules of interruption did not quite apply here. His gray eyes moved between his mother's face and the tall, dark-haired stranger with the expression of a small philosopher cataloging data. Elara placed her hand on his shoulder. The warmth of him beneath her palm steadied her the way it always did. This small, solid, entirely real person who had been her reason and her anchor through every difficult morning of the last 5 years. She looked at Sebastian. This is James, she said, simply. Without preamble or apology or the elaborate emotional scaffolding she had constructed and dismantled in her imagination 100 times against the possibility of this exact moment. Sebastian's gaze moved to the boy again. Up close, the resemblance was even more impossible to overlook. It was not merely the coloring, the dark hair, the gray eyes, but the particular quality of stillness, the way James held himself, the precision of his attention. Sebastian looked at his son the way a man looks at something he did not know he had lost until he found it, standing in the cold in a village he had never heard of, looking back at him with calm, curious, entirely unsentimental interest. He crouched down. Slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything, never careless, never rushed. He brought himself to the boy's level and looked at him directly, which most adults did not do with children, and James noticed immediately because James noticed everything. Hello, James, Sebastian said. His voice was different at this register. Softer. Still controlled, but with something underneath it that was not controlled at all. James studied him with the gravity of a small judge. You know my name, he observed. Your mother just told me. James considered this. You were looking at me before she said it, he pointed out. Something moved through Sebastian's expression that was almost a smile. You are very observant, he said. Mama says that too, James replied without particular pride, as though it were simply a fact about himself that he had filed away and occasionally referenced. He tilted his head slightly. Your eyes are the same as mine. The almost smile became something more complicated. Sebastian held the boy's gaze steadily. They are, he agreed. Why? The question landed in the cold morning air with the particular devastating simplicity that only children can produce. Not cruel, not strategic, simply direct in the way that cuts past every careful adult construction and arrives at the only thing that actually matters. Sebastian looked up at Elara. She was watching him with those dark eyes that had always seen more of him than he was entirely comfortable with. In them he could read nothing conclusive, no invitation, no dismissal. Only a kind of watchful waiting. The same expression she had worn years ago when she was deciding whether to trust him. He had not realized then what an extraordinary gift her trust had been. He had not understood that some things, once broken, require years of patient, unglamorous effort to repair, and that the effort itself, not the destination, is what demonstrates whether a person is worth trusting again. He looked back at James. Because, he said carefully, honestly, in the tone of a man who has decided that the only currency worth spending in this moment is the truth, I am your father. James received this information with extraordinary composure. He looked at Sebastian for a long moment, then looked at his mother, then looked back at Sebastian. Did you know? He asked. Before today? No, Sebastian said. I did not know you existed until this morning. Are you angry? No. The answer came without hesitation, without the slight pause of a man performing sincerity. It was simply immediate and entirely true. I am not angry at all. James nodded slowly, processing. Then he asked the question that undid Sebastian Ashford more completely than anything else had ever managed to, more than 5 years of searching, more than the sleepless nights, more than standing in an empty ballroom the morning after Elara vanished and understanding for the first time what it meant to lose the only thing that had ever felt worth keeping. Are you going to leave again? James asked. Sebastian did not look at Elara for guidance. He did not calculate or measure or compose a careful, qualified answer. He simply looked at his son, this small, serious, extraordinary person who had his eyes and his mother's courage and 4 years of life that Sebastian had not been present for and could never recover, and he said, with the quiet certainty of a man making the only promise he had ever meant completely, No, I am not going to leave. The wind dropped for a moment. The moors stretched gray and vast behind the village rooftops. Elara's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her son's shoulder, and Sebastian felt it, felt the significance of that small involuntary movement, the way you feel a change in the weather before it arrives. He rose from his crouch and turned to face her fully. They stood 3 feet apart, which was close enough to speak quietly and far enough to maintain the careful pretense that this was a conversation between 2 reasonable adults and not the most consequential moment either of them had experienced in 5 years of living. You should come inside, Elara said finally. Not an invitation so much as a practical concession to the gathering clouds above the moors. It is going to rain. It already is, Sebastian said. And indeed, the first few drops had begun. Light and cold, the kind of northern rain that doesn't announce itself dramatically but simply arrives and intends to stay. She turned and walked toward the cottage without waiting to see if he followed. He did. James walked between them with his hands clasped behind his back in an unconscious imitation of his father's habitual posture that Sebastian noticed immediately and said nothing about, because some things are too large to comment on without your voice betraying you. The cottage was small and immaculately kept. Bookshelves on every wall, a low fire burning in the grate, a child's drawings pinned above the mantelpiece with the kind of careful, loving attention that made Sebastian's chest ache in a way he could not have articulated if asked. A blue ceramic pot of wildflowers on the table. Ink stains on the windowsill. The particular smell of old books and wood smoke and something baking. The smell of a life that was whole without him. He stood in the center of it and felt, acutely, how much he had missed. Mrs. Hadley appeared from the kitchen, took one look at Sebastian with the sharp, unsentimental eye of a woman who has seen everything and is impressed by very little, and said to Elara, I'll take the boy for his lesson, shall I? Without waiting for an answer, collecting James with practiced efficiency and disappearing back through the kitchen door. James went without protest but turned at the last moment to look at Sebastian with those gray eyes. You will still be here? He asked. Yes, Sebastian said. James nodded once. Satisfied. Gone. The silence that followed was the particular kind that forms between 2 people who have too much to say and no clean place to begin. Elara set the kettle on the fire. Sebastian watched her move through her own space, efficient, unhurried, entirely herself, and understood that whatever he had come here imagining, whatever version of this reunion he had rehearsed in carriages and sleepless rooms across 5 years of searching, The actual woman standing 3 feet from him was more complicated and more complete than the one he had carried in his memory. She had not merely survived. She had built something. She had made a life of genuine substance from the ruins of what he had, however unintentionally, helped destroy. That was not a small thing. He did not intend to treat it as one. "You said you wrote to investigators," she said, her back still to him. "3 of them." "Yes. And none of them found me. Not for lack of effort." She turned then. Her expression was not hostile, but it was not soft either. It was the expression of a woman who has done considerable internal work and is not prepared to undo it carelessly. "What would you have done," she said, "if they had found me in the first year? Before James was born? Before any of this?" Sebastian considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I would have asked you to come home. And if I had refused? I would have asked you why. And if I had told you? Then I would have spent however long it required making you believe that what you saw in that corridor was not what it appeared to be." He paused. "And if you still refused, if you had looked at me and said you did not want the life we had planned, I would have let you go." He held her gaze. "Properly. Not the way you left. Not without a word." Something flickered in her eyes. "That is a very composed answer for a man standing in a cottage he was not invited to. I have had 5 years to compose it." "And does it sound," she asked quietly, "the way you intended?" "It sounds," he said, with the faint, difficult honesty that was the only register he truly trusted, "considerably less adequate than the situation warrants." She almost smiled. Almost. The corner of her mouth moved in a way he recognized, the involuntary precursor to an expression she was deciding whether or not to permit herself. He took a step toward her. Stopped. Old habit, always stopping. Always waiting for permission before closing distance. Always afraid of being the thing that overwhelmed rather than the thing that was wanted. "Elara." His voice was low. "I need you to tell me something honestly. When have I ever been otherwise?" "Never," he said. "Which is precisely why I am asking." He looked at her, really looked, the way he had not allowed himself to do since stepping out of the carriage, because looking at her directly required a composure he was not entirely certain he still possessed. "Did you love me? When you left? In spite of everything you believed you had seen, did you still love me when you walked out of that ballroom?" The kettle began to murmur on the grate. Elara looked at him for a long, steady moment, the look of a woman measuring not the question but the person asking it, weighing not words but the years behind them. "I have never," she said very quietly, "stopped." The words fell into the small warm room like something that had been suspended a long time and finally released. Sebastian exhaled slowly. It was not a dramatic sound. It was the sound of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just, for the first time, been permitted to set it down. "Then let me explain," he said. "All of it. Properly. Everything you did not stay to hear 5 years ago." He paused. "And when I am finished, if you still want me gone, I will go. I will trouble you with nothing further. But I will not leave this village without you knowing the truth." Elara studied him, the gray eyes, the composed mouth, the hands that were not quite steady at his sides. "Then sit down," she said, turning to lift the kettle from the fire. "And talk." He sat. Not in the armchair nearest the fire, which would have been the comfortable choice, but in the straight-back chair at the kitchen table, the one that faced her directly, the one that offered no softness or strategic distance. It was a deliberate choice and she recognized it as such. Sebastian Ashford had always communicated as much through what he did not do as through what he did. She set 2 cups on the table. Sat across from him. Wrapped both hands around her cup the way she always did when she was preparing to hear something difficult, as though warmth at the palms could fortify the rest of her. "Begin," she said. He did. He told her about Vivienne, the full truth of it, methodically and without self-pity. How her sister had come to him 3 weeks before the ball, pale and trembling and ashamed, confessing that she had developed feelings she could neither control nor honorably conceal. How she had wept. How she had begged him not to tell Elara, not because she wished to protect herself but because she could not bear to be the source of her sister's pain. How Sebastian had sat with that confession for 3 long weeks, determining the most decent way to handle it, not for his own sake but for Elara's, because the last thing he had wanted was for the woman he intended to marry to spend her wedding morning wondering if her sister harbored something unresolved. "I chose the night of the ball," he said, Because Vivienne was already distressed. She had been avoiding you for days and you had noticed. I could see it in your face every time you looked for her across a room. He paused. I thought if I spoke to her clearly, if I drew a line she could see and understand, it would be finished before our wedding. You would never need to know. Elara said nothing. Her hands tightened fractionally around her cup. I did not account, he continued, for how it would appear. I did not think about the door being open. I did not think about you coming to find her at precisely that moment. His voice was steady but not indifferent. Beneath the composure she could hear it. The years of it, the weight of a mistake that had never been corrected because she had not remained long enough to allow it. That is not an excuse. It is simply what happened. The fire shifted in the grate. Outside, the rain had settled into its determined northern rhythm against the cottage windows. She never told me, Elara said quietly. I know. In the letter I left her, 3 words she wrote back once. She looked down at her cup. She said she was sorry. She did not say for what specifically. I assumed, she stopped. You assumed the worst possible version, Sebastian said. Not an accusation. Simply an observation, made gently, from the position of a man who understood completely why that version had been the one she chose. I had evidence, she said, with a flash of something fierce underneath the quietness. I had eyes, Sebastian. I had your hands on her face. I had the exact gesture. She stopped again, pressing her lips together. The exact gesture I had used with you, he finished. Yes. The word landed between them like something sharp. He did not flinch from it. You are right to say it, he said. It looked like what it looked like. And I will spend a considerable amount of time being angry at myself for giving you that image instead of what was true. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, closing the distance between them by inches without moving from his chair. But I need you to understand something, Elara. I need you to understand it not because it excuses anything but because you have been carrying the wrong story for 5 years and it has cost you things that cannot be returned. She looked at him. Waiting. There has been no one else, he said. Not in 5 years. Not in the weeks between the ball and the morning I understood you were truly gone. Not once, not briefly, not in any of the ways that men in my position are expected to console themselves. His gray eyes held hers without wavering. I am not telling you this to manufacture obligation. I am telling you because you deserve to know that what you left behind was real. That I did not replace it. That it did not diminish. Pause. That I did not let it. The rain intensified briefly against the glass, then settled again. Elara set her cup down with careful precision. She rose from the table and moved to the window, standing with her back to him, looking out at the gray wet square where an hour ago the entire architecture of her carefully constructed life had shifted without warning. She had built something real here. She knew that. She had assembled it piece by piece from the wreckage of a single terrible night. The teaching position, the cottage, Mrs. Hadley's soup, James's laughter filling rooms that had once felt too quiet. She had made herself sufficient. She had done the extraordinary, unglamorous work of becoming a person who did not require rescue. And yet, she could feel him behind her, his presence in the small room as palpable as the warmth from the grate. 5 years had not diminished it. If anything, the intervening time had stripped away everything peripheral, everything social and ceremonial and performative, leaving only the essential thing, the particular frequency at which Sebastian Ashford existed in the world, which had always, from the very first afternoon she had spent in his company, resonated with something fundamental in her own. That was the inconvenient truth she had never successfully argued herself out of. I believe you, she said to the window. She heard him exhale behind her. I believed you the moment you began speaking, she continued. That is what makes this so extraordinarily complicated. She turned. He was watching her with an expression she had no single word for, careful and open and stripped of every defense, the face of a man who has decided that vulnerability is the only honest currency remaining to him. Because believing you does not undo 5 years, Sebastian. It does not give James back the mornings you were not there for. It does not return the night I spent on a train convincing myself I was not destroyed. Her voice remained level but only just. Believing you only means I have been grieving something that did not have to be lost. He stood. He did not cross the room. He simply stood, bringing himself to his full height, and looked at her with the gray eyes that their son had inherited, and said nothing for a moment because some responses require the courage to resist filling silence with inadequate words. "I know," he said finally. "I know that. And I am not here to ask you to pretend otherwise." He moved then, slowly, deliberately, the way he had always moved, never careless, until he was close enough that she would have had to take only a single step to close the remaining distance between them. He stopped there. Waiting. Always waiting for permission. "I am here," he said quietly, "to ask if the thing that was lost can be found again. Not restored to what it was. I understand that is not possible." His voice dropped lower. "But built into something new. Something that accounts for all of it, the loss and the years and James and every cold morning in this village that I was not present for." He paused. "Something real." Elara looked at him for a long moment, the kind of moment that contains multitudes, that compresses years of feeling into a single breath, that requires the whole of a person's courage simply to survive without looking away. "You are asking me," she said slowly, "to trust you again." "Yes. You understand what that word costs me now." "I do." His voice did not waver. "I understand it costs more than it did before. And I am asking anyway. Not because I believe I deserve it, I am under no such illusion, but because I believe you deserve to know that someone is willing to spend however long it takes earning it back." He paused. "However long, Elara. I want to be precise about that. I do not mean weeks. I do not mean a season of good behavior followed by an expectation of reward. I mean years if that is what is required. I mean showing up in this village every morning if you will allow it. I mean learning who James is, not who I imagine him to be but actually who he is. I mean being present for the ordinary, unglamorous, unremarkable days that constitute an actual life, rather than appearing only for the moments that look like redemption." Something moved through her chest that was not quite pain and not quite relief but lived in the complicated territory between them. "You have been rehearsing that," she said. "For approximately 4 years, he admitted. She almost laughed. The almost laugh became something else, a sharp, sudden pressure behind her eyes that she refused to permit into full expression, because she had not cried in front of Sebastian Ashford 5 years ago when it might have saved everything, and she was not certain she was prepared to begin now. But then he did something she had not anticipated. He reached into the interior pocket of his coat and withdrew a letter. Old, the paper soft with handling, the edges worn in the way of something folded and unfolded countless times over a long period. He set it on the table between them without explanation. She looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" "The letter I wrote you," he said, "the morning after the ball. When I went to find you and discovered you were gone." He held her gaze. "I have carried it for 5 years on the rather irrational basis that if I ever found you, I wanted you to understand that the things I am saying now are not constructed for this moment. That they existed from the beginning. That you were not a conclusion I arrived at after exhausting other options." He paused. "You were never an option, Elara. You were always the point." The room was very quiet. The rain moved against the windows. The fire settled. Somewhere beyond the kitchen door, faint and distant, James could be heard asking Mrs. Hadley a question about something with a focused persistence that was entirely his own particular genius. Elara picked up the letter. She unfolded it slowly, the paper so soft with years of handling that it felt almost like fabric. The handwriting was Sebastian's, unmistakably precise and controlled, but here rendered with a quality she had never seen in his correspondence before. Urgency. The pen pressed harder in certain places. The lines slightly less even than his habitual perfection. She read. She read every word of a letter written by a man who had stood in an empty ballroom at 4 in the morning understanding that the woman he loved had vanished and that he had, through the specific cruelty of circumstance and his own failure to close a door, provided her with precisely enough evidence to construct the worst possible interpretation of his character. The letter was not eloquent in the polished sense. It was something rawer than that. It was a man who normally expressed himself through careful understatement abandoning that entirely in favor of simple, direct, undefended truth. He had written about the sparrow in the garden. He had written about the rainy afternoons and the ridiculous adventure novels. He had written about the first time she had disagreed with him openly, across a dinner table full of people who never disagreed with him, and how he had looked at her in that moment and thought, with the clarity of genuine recognition, there she is. The actual person. Right there. He had written, I have spent my entire life in rooms full of people performing versions of themselves for my benefit, and I had forgotten that real people exist until you sat across from me and simply were yourself without apology or calculation, and I did not know how to tell you that this was the most extraordinary thing I had ever witnessed because I did not have the language for it yet. And at the very end, in letters pressed harder than all the rest. If you are reading this, then you came back or I found you, and either way I need you to know that I have not spent a single day of the intervening time not looking. Not one day, Elara. Not one. She folded the letter. She held it in both hands and looked at the table and breathed, slow and deliberate, the way she had taught herself to breathe through difficult things in the years when breathing itself had sometimes required conscious effort. Sebastian said nothing. He had given her everything he had brought with him. There was nothing left to offer except the truth of his presence in the room and his willingness to remain in it under whatever terms she required. Then, from beyond the kitchen door, came a sound that cut through every carefully maintained adult composure in the room. James, her son, his son, their son, was crying. Not the ordinary crying of a tired or frustrated child. Something different. High and frightened and sudden. Elara was moving before the thought had fully formed. She crossed the room in 4 steps and pushed through the kitchen door, Sebastian 1 step behind her, instinct overriding every careful social boundary, his hand catching the door above her head as they entered together. Mrs. Hadley was kneeling on the kitchen floor beside James, her face tight with controlled alarm. James was on his feet but barely, his face white as chalk, his small hand pressed to his forearm where a deep gash from the edge of a fallen ceramic bowl was bleeding with a speed and volume that made Elara's stomach drop entirely. "It slipped," Mrs. Hadley said quickly. He was reaching and it slipped. Elara was already beside him, already tearing the hem of her underskirt with a precision born of 5 years of managing every emergency alone. "James, look at me. Look at Mama's face." James looked at her. His eyes were wide and wet and frightened, but he was looking, focused, present, brave in the specific way he was always brave, which was quietly and without performance. "You are all right," she said, with the absolute conviction of a woman who has decided that this is true regardless of evidence to the contrary. She pressed the cloth to his arm firmly. "You are completely all right. It is only blood. Blood is dramatic, but it is not dangerous. Tell me something, what is Mrs. Hadley's cat called?" "Bartholomew," James said in a small wet voice. "And what is Bartholomew's opinion of Tuesdays?" A wavering, watery almost smile. "He hates them. Everyone sensible does." She kept her voice even, steady, the tone she had developed over 4 years of being the only person in the room who could not afford to be frightened. "Hold still for me." Then Sebastian was beside her. He did not hover. He did not insert himself with the clumsy overeagerness of a man desperate to demonstrate usefulness. He simply knelt on the other side of James, close but not crowding, present but not consuming, and said in a voice pitched low and entirely calm, "May I?" He was looking at her, asking permission. Even now. She met his eyes for a single second. Then she nodded. Sebastian shifted the cloth with a steadiness of hand that she had not expected and assessed the wound with a focused, practical attention that was completely absent of panic. "It needs proper binding," he said. "Not stitches, it is clean and not deep enough. But firm pressure for 10 minutes and a proper bandage." He looked at James directly. "You are being extraordinarily brave." James studied him with reddened eyes. "Are you scared?" he asked. Sebastian held his gaze. "Yes," he said. "Quite." James blinked. "You do not look it." "That," Sebastian said, "is something of a family trait. You appear to have inherited it." James looked down at his arm, then back at Sebastian, then at his mother, then back at Sebastian, the small philosopher cataloging something new, something that did not yet have a name but was quietly, irrevocably, taking up permanent residence in the architecture of who he was. "Okay," he said softly. And in that single small word, in the utter simplicity of it, the trust compressed within it, Elara felt something shift in the deepest part of her that had been braced and defended and carefully closed for 5 years. The 10 minutes passed in the particular silence of people who have moved beyond the need to fill space with words. Sebastian held the binding firm. James sat between them on the kitchen floor with the gravity of a child who understands that something larger than a cut arm is being decided in this room, in this moment, by the quality of how the adults around him are breathing. When the bleeding had slowed and the proper bandage was secured, Sebastian's work, neat and precise, James looked down at his arm with solemn satisfaction and then looked up at the man kneeling beside him. "You knew what to do," he said. "My younger brother was spectacularly accident-prone," Sebastian said. "I had considerable practice. I did not know you had a brother." "There is a great deal we do not yet know about each other," Sebastian said. "I am hoping we will have time to remedy that." James considered this with the particular stillness that was his most characteristic expression, that quality of deep, unhurried processing that made him seem, at 4 years old, occasionally ancient. Then he said, with the devastating simplicity that had already proven itself the most powerful force in the room, "I would like that." Sebastian looked at the boy, his son, this extraordinary small person who had arrived in the world without him and become himself entirely anyway, and the last of whatever remaining composure he had been maintaining quietly dissolved. Not visibly. Not with any sound. Only in the eyes, which Elara was watching, and which told her everything that the controlled face beneath them was still attempting to conceal. She reached across James and placed her hand over Sebastian's. Just that. No words. No declaration. Simply her hand over his on the kitchen floor of a small northern cottage while the rain continued its patient work against the windows and the fire burned low in the next room and Mrs. Hadley discreetly removed herself to somewhere distant and tactful. Sebastian turned his hand beneath hers and held it. They stayed like that for a long moment, the three of them on the kitchen floor, which was not how either adult had imagined this day concluding, and was precisely right for that reason. Life's most significant moments, Elara had learned, rarely arrive in ballrooms. They arrive in kitchens. In cold village squares. In the unheroic, unglamorous, completely ordinary spaces where real people actually live. James looked at their joined hands. Then up at his mother. Then at Sebastian. "Are you going to stay for supper?" he asked Sebastian with the pragmatic directness of a child who processes emotional complexity through logistics. Sebastian looked at Elara. Elara looked at him. At the gray eyes, the careful mouth, the man who had written a letter he carried for 5 years and knelt on a kitchen floor without hesitation and told their son the truth without flinching and asked for nothing except the chance to earn what he had lost. And she made the decision that she had, if she was entirely honest with herself, been moving toward from the moment she saw him step out of that carriage and felt the ground shift beneath 5 years of careful surviving. "He is going to stay," she said. "For supper and considerably beyond." The smile that crossed Sebastian Ashford's face in that moment was not the composed, controlled almost smile that London society had catalogued and speculated about for years. It was something entirely different, unguarded and genuine and luminous in the way that only expressions which have been suppressed for a very long time can be when they are finally, fully permitted. It transformed him completely. It made him look, Elara thought, like the man she had first fallen in love with. The real one, beneath all the dukedom and the composure and the careful performance of someone who had learned very young that the world is safer when you do not let it see what you actually feel. James studied the smile with deep satisfaction, as though he had produced it himself, which in a manner of speaking he had. "Good," he said simply, and climbed to his feet with the resilience of the young and went to inspect Bartholomew, who had appeared in the doorway with the supreme indifference of a cat who considers kitchen floor dramas beneath his dignity. Sebastian rose. Elara rose. They stood facing each other in the small warm kitchen, close enough now that there was no pretense of careful distance remaining, and he lifted his free hand and placed it against her face with a tenderness so precise and so restrained and so full of everything that had been waiting 5 years for permission to exist that she felt it move through her like a note struck on a bell, resonating long after the initial contact. "I will spend the rest of my life," he said very quietly, "making sure you never have cause to vanish again." She covered his hand with hers. Held it against her cheek. Looked at him with the dark eyes that had always seen him clearly, not the Duke, not the title, not the performance, but the actual man beneath all of it, imperfect and private and capable of extraordinary love when he was not too frightened of it to allow it full expression. "You should know," she said, with the composure of a woman who has survived the unsurvivable and come through it into something stronger and clearer than what existed before, "that I am considerably more difficult to lose than I once was." Something moved through his gray eyes, recognition, admiration, the particular warmth of a man looking at a woman he loves and understanding that she has become, in the years of his absence, even more herself than she was before. "Good," he said. "Soft. Certain. I am considerably more determined to keep you." And in the small warm kitchen, while the northern rain gentled against the glass and their son negotiated solemnly with an indifferent cat and the fire burned steadily in the next room, not the roaring blaze of new beginnings but the reliable, enduring warmth of something that has survived wind and distance and years of cold and continued burning anyway, Sebastian Ashford kissed Elara Sinclair for the first time in 5 years. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not the kind that poets reach for superlatives to describe. It was quiet and certain and full of the specific gravity of two people who have lost each other completely and found their way back through the most ordinary, extraordinary miracle of simply refusing, both of them in their separate ways across 5 years of distance, to stop believing that what they had was worth recovering. When they separated, Elara rested her forehead against his, the same gesture she had misread in a corridor 5 years ago, understanding now with the whole of herself what it actually meant. Not betrayal. Not replacement. Simply two people, foreheads touching, sharing the weight of something difficult in the only way that actually works. Together. James looked up from across the kitchen. He observed his parents standing together in the golden light of the small cottage, his father's hand still cradling his mother's face, his mother's hand still covering his father's, both of them quiet and certain and entirely present in the way that people are when they have finally, after a very long time, arrived exactly where they were always supposed to be. He looked at them for a long moment with his gray eyes, those extraordinary, ancient, entirely unsentimental gray eyes that were his father's and his own simultaneously. Then he looked back at Bartholomew. "I told you," he said to the cat, with the satisfaction of a small philosopher whose hypothesis has been conclusively proven, that he would stay. Bartholomew offered no opinion. But outside at precisely that moment the rain stopped. The clouds parted over the northern moors with the unhurried grace of something that has been building toward this for a very long time. And the late afternoon light came through the cottage window, amber and rose and that particular shade of violet that had reminded Elara, from her very first morning in Dunmore, of nothing sad at all, and fell across the three of them like a benediction. Like a beginning. Like the first page of the only story that had ever, from the very start, been worth telling.